welcome. We begin the day going down the list of the biggest global risks of 2024. Every January, we take stock of what threatened the world as we know it last year and what could do the same in the new year. And this January is no different. For 2024, some of the global risks are all too familiar, some to be expected. And that's according to the Eurasia Group. In its annual global risk report, the U.S. presidential election has the dubious honor of top global risk. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, and El Nino are also included for 2024. Well, joining me now is Ian Bremmer, president and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Ian, it's good to see you. It's good to, we meet like this every year, it seems, in January. Let's talk first about the U.S. presidential election, being risk number one. You are not alone here in putting it at the top of the list. I'd like to get your reaction to what a constitutional law professor told me last night on this program when I asked about a possible Trump victory come November. Take a listen.
Donald Trump becomes president again, he's already decided he's going to wreak vengeance on anyone who opposes him, especially the so-called enemies he already has in the government and anybody who didn't vote for him before. But he's also going to join with other strong men, dictators around the country, around the world, and create havoc around the globe. It will not just rest within the borders of the United States. There will be, I would say, perhaps World War III, if he is allowed to join with other dictators and put in place the nationalist themes that he's already advocated in the United States.
Ian, what do you say to that? I mean, are we talking about a risk that is so acute, so severe that we could be looking at another world war?
Let me walk back from the brink a little bit, but I think that the United States democracy is in crisis. If you look at our report, we look at American trust in institutions from Congress and the executive to the media and the judiciary to the church, and they have all been going down, down, down. Nothing is stopping that. The U.S. is the one democracy in the G7 that does not have the committed ability to have a free and fair transfer of power in a legitimate national election. That is a serious issue that we should not normalize. And in the next few months, Donald Trump, who had tried to overturn the outcome of the 2020 election, is enormously likely to become the nominee of the Republican Party. And when he does, the Republicans will be loyal to him and he will become much more powerful overnight, which means his policies not just domestically, but also internationally, his willingness to go after Biden, his willingness to cut off the Ukrainians, his willingness to go after the Iranians, trade decoupling with the Chinese, those will become policies that the Republicans as a party will pursue. And so this is not just about the coin flip of where we end up come this November, but it's also about the entire year where we're going to be in a much more divided, much more problematic policy environment for the U.S. and for its allies around the world than people are expecting.
And even if President Biden were to win re-election, you're warning that the risks from Donald Trump, they will remain. Is that correct?
Well, Biden has been president for the last nearly 4 years. And while on Biden's watch, the legitimacy of U.S. political institutions has deteriorated. The House has been absent a speaker and is now much weaker. For example, the judiciary has been seen as weaker and more politicized. Biden certainly has tried to reduce that level of dysfunction. He's failed. He does not have the ability. And so it is not clear to me that if you elect Biden for 4 more years, from 82 to 86 years of age, that he's going to be more effective than he was in the first 4. And of course, also the stakes for Trump are much higher. If Biden wins, he faces jail. Trump does. And knowing that, if it looks like it's going to be very close, if it looks like Biden is going to win and Trump is going to lose, the likelihood that Trump would get his supporters, try to get his supporters to interfere with the election also the target of the U.S. election for adversaries around the world, the Russians, for example, the Iranians, the North Koreans, far more significant in potentially leading to chaos than we've seen in 2016 or 2020. So for many reasons, unfortunately, barring, we don't need to be talking about World War III to recognize that the U.S. versus itself is today by far the most significant geopolitical risk on the global stage for 2024.
And in the meantime, much of the world's attention is focused on the war in Gaza, in the Middle East. The Eurasia Group has listed this escalation from this conflict as the year's second biggest risk. Where do you see this conflict going forward?
Very hard to maintain the war in the Middle East largely on the territory only of Gaza. And I use the word only advisedly. I know that's not been easy for anyone to watch or experience, but there are so many other ways that this war can escalate. Whether you look at the northern front and Hezbollah, where the fighting has been expanding, and with an adversary that is much more powerful than Hamas is in Gaza to the Israelis, the Houthis, who the Americans have been warning, don't continue these strikes. They continue to do it. They become more violent, more frequent. That could easily lead to U.S. strikes, maybe with allies, against Houthi bases in Yemen. That would clearly expand the war. You also have Iranian proxies who they are actively supporting to fight against Israel and the United States among Shia militants in Iraq, in Syria. Greater likelihood that that draws the Iranians into a direct fight with Israel, with the United States. And finally, the radicalization of Muslim populations around the world, some of whom will become violent, some of whom will become organized in terrorist organizations or lone wolf attacks in the United States, in Europe, and in the region. These are all things that are likely to occur. It is frankly much harder to see how over the next year, given all of that, you could contain this war to Gaza as opposed to the many, many ways that the war is likely to grow.
And there's this accusation from last year that the war in Gaza was sucking all of the oxygen out of the room away from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Where do you see that in 2024? Ukraine will be, in effect, partitioned? Is that where you think this is headed?
Yeah, and of course the Ukrainians won't accept that. Neither will the Germans. Neither will the Americans. But we don't accept North Korea having nuclear weapons. Doesn't stopping them from having nuclear weapons. Partitioned Ukraine is what we're looking at, where they're not able to retake some 18% of their territory that Russia presently occupies illegally, and it is possible that the trajectory of the war will turn against Ukraine, especially if they don't continue to get military support, strong military support from the United States, which is challenging in 2024 and becomes more challenging when Trump is the nominee, more challenging still if he wins the presidential election in November. And Putin, of course, is watching that very closely. So in 2024, Putin has zero reason to come to the table, lots of reason to wait, lots of reason to continue to keep the pressure on Ukraine very, very high. That is going to drive a wedge in Europe because you'll have several governments like Poland, the Baltics, Finland, Sweden, that are deeply concerned that they need to provide the support to Ukraine no matter what. They can't allow the Ukrainians to fall. But others who are saying it's not my fight, it's too expensive, we're getting tired. Clearly, that's a big problem in this environment.
And Ian, before we run out of time, I want to ask you, I noticed that El Nino was on the list. And let me ask you, do you see a possibility there of some type of black swan event being created with the help of El Nino? I'm imagining, let's say we have a huge hurricane that slams into the east coast of the United States on Election Day in early November, making voting impossible for millions of Americans. I mean, can you imagine that would happen? And what kind of repercussions would that have for the election? Is that a real risk?
I'm probably much more worried about the political intervention against a soft and complex homeland security target like the U.S. elections than I am about a natural disaster. But you are right that the frequency and the intensity of these natural disasters, especially in an El Nino year, informed by 1.2 degrees of climate change that we are already globally experiencing, will create more black swan climate events. And increasingly, these black swan events are not black swans. They're things that we should be ready for every year. Last year, we talked about the water crisis, which is still treated as a crisis that occurs and you need to respond to it. And yet, the global water environment is one that this is a structural condition that we need new institutions for. We need new infrastructure for, new capacity for. That's what we certainly need when it comes more broadly to combating climate change. And as you saw with the hard-fought efforts to agree to a loss and damages fund at the COP28 summit in Abu Dhabi, you're not even close to the money, to the resources required to make that a reality.
Ian Bremmer, as always, Ian, good talking with you and good going through the list. We are trying to make sure that no one can say that they were not warned ahead of time. Ian, thank you.
Thanks so much.